You're in 14th century Europe. Your armpit has a swelling the size of a lemon. It appeared 2 days ago. Yesterday it turned black. You have a fever that feels like your skull is being cooked from the inside. You can't walk. You can barely breathe. And the doctor who just walked into your room is holding a pigeon. Not medicine, not herbs, not a blade for bloodletting. A pigeon, alive, wings flapping, deeply unimpressed about the situation. He walks toward you, holds the bird against the swelling under your arm, and waits. This is the cure. This is the best medical intervention 14th century Europe has to offer. A confused bird pressed against a lump on your body while the world outside is actively collapsing. And the insane part? There was logic behind it, deeply flawed, ultimately fatal logic. Logic that had been built over centuries, endorsed by the greatest medical minds in the ancient world, and passed down through generations of trained doctors who had no reason to question it. This is the story of plague medicine, of the bubonic plague specifically, of a disease so catastrophic it killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population in under a decade. In some cities, the mortality rate hit 60, 70, even 80%. Some villages were simply erased. The speed of it was incomprehensible. You could feel fine at breakfast and be dead by nightfall. Physicians who had spent decades studying medicine, who were the most educated people in their societies, watched patient after patient die regardless of what they did. Nothing worked. Nothing even slowed it. And they had absolutely no idea why. Because germ theory, the understanding that disease is caused by microscopic organisms, didn't exist yet. Louis Pasteur wasn't born until 1822. Robert Koch didn't publish his work until the 1880s. Medieval doctors weren't stupid. They weren't ignoring evidence. They were working with the only framework they had, a framework that had been the dominant medical theory in the Western world for over 1,000 years. The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance between these four humors. Disease was an imbalance. Treatment meant restoring that balance. It was elegant. It was systematic. It gave physicians a logical framework for diagnosing and treating every condition they encountered. And for a pre-scientific world, it worked often enough to seem credible. But bubonic plague wasn't a humor imbalance. It was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so aggressive it could kill a healthy adult in 72 hours, and no amount of balancing black bile was going to stop it. When the plague arrived, physicians tried to fit its symptoms into the existing framework. The swellings, the buboes, were an obvious focal point. They were warm, hard, filled with fluid. In humoral terms, this clearly represented a dangerous accumulation of corrupt matter that needed to be drawn out, transferred, or neutralized. This is where the pigeons came from. Birds, particularly pigeons, were understood to generate significant internal heat. Their body temperature is genuinely higher than ours, running between 40 and 42 degrees Celsius. Medieval physicians observed this and interpreted it within humoral theory. The bird's heat was understood to be a powerful drawing force, capable of pulling corrupt matter out of an affected body part and into the bird. The bird would absorb it, sicken, die, and in dying would carry the disease away from the patient. Some physicians used live pigeons first, believing the living heat was more potent. When the bird died from absorbing the corruption, they would replace it with another live bird. Others used freshly killed pigeons, split open, the warm, wet interior of the carcass pressed against the bubo to maintain heat contact. It was documented medical practice, recommended by university-educated doctors in France, Italy, Germany, and England. There were serious academic discussions about whether plucked pigeons worked better than unplucked ones, whether the cloaca should be placed closest to the swelling to maximize drawing, whether multiple birds applied simultaneously would accelerate the process. This was the peer-reviewed medicine of its time. And it was completely ineffective. The patients who recovered despite the pigeon treatment did so because of their own immune systems, not because of anything the pigeon did. The patients who died, which was most of them, died because Yersinia pestis is extraordinarily lethal. When the pigeon treatment didn't work, the conclusion wasn't that the pigeon treatment was wrong. The conclusion was that the treatment hadn't been applied correctly. The theory was preserved by adjusting the explanation for failure, because every failure gets absorbed into the framework as a variation rather than a contradiction. Bloodletting was common. If the corruption was in the blood, removing blood removed corruption. Physicians bled patients who were already dying from an illness that caused massive internal bleeding. This killed people faster. Lancing the buboes was practiced, and this one actually had some marginal effect in some cases, not because it drew out corruption, but because it relieved pressure and in some instances allowed the lymph node to drain. Accidentally partially effective for the wrong reason. Theriac was prescribed, containing dozens of ingredients including viper flesh, opium, and honey. Its high cost actually made physicians recommend it more confidently and completely useless against plague. Aromatic herbs were burned constantly. Bad smells caused disease. Therefore, good smells prevented it. Physicians and wealthy citizens walked through plague streets holding pomanders, small perforated containers of perfumed herbs, to their faces. The beak-shaped masks later associated with plague doctors were designed to hold aromatic herbs in the beak, filtering the air before inhalation. The miasma theory was also wrong, but it did result in one unintentionally correct behavior: avoiding crowded, enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, not because of miasma, but as a side effect of avoiding the environments where bad smells concentrated. There were physicians who noticed something strange about the buboes that the pigeon treatment was meant to address. The swellings were always in the same locations: armpit, groin, neck, never randomly distributed across the body. Some physicians noted that patients often had flea bites near the sites of the swellings, but without the concept of vector transmission, of a flea-carrying bacteria from a rat to a human, the connection was invisible. They were looking directly at the evidence and couldn't see it, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked the conceptual framework. But that intelligence operating inside a broken framework is not enough. You can be rigorous, educated, observant, and systematic and still be completely wrong, because the model you're using to interpret your observations is wrong. The Black Death eventually subsided, not because of medicine, because enough people died that the disease ran out of dense populations to move through. Because some portion of the surviving population carried a genetic resistance to Yersinia pestis that we can still detect in European descendants today. The physicians who survived mostly believed their interventions had contributed. The medical consensus emerging from the Black Death didn't fundamentally challenge humoral theory. It refined the protocols, updated the plague treatises, debated the relative merits of different drawing agents. The pigeon treatment remained in circulation for centuries, documented as recently as the 17th century plague outbreaks in London and continental Europe. By that point, 2.5 centuries had passed since the Black Death. The pigeon treatment was still being used. Bloodletting was still being used. Theriac was still being sold at enormous expense to the wealthy. Germ theory was still 200 years away. What was required wasn't better application of the existing system. It was the complete replacement of the system. Koch and Pasteur and the bacteriological revolution of the 19th century didn't just add to existing medical knowledge. They demolished the foundation and built an entirely new one. Humoral theory collapsed almost instantly once germ theory was demonstrated. 2,000 years of the dominant medical framework in Western civilization gone within a generation. Which means every physician who ever pressed a pigeon against a dying patient, every doctor who bled patients with plague and watched them die faster, every practitioner who recommended theriac and charged a small fortune for it, was doing exactly what a competent, educated, well-intentioned professional would do with the knowledge available to them. They were wrong. Comprehensively, fatally wrong. But they weren't negligent. They were limited. By the paradigm of their time, by the absence of tools that hadn't been invented yet, by the impossibility of seeing past a framework that had no visible edge. The pigeon pressed against the swelling wasn't ignorance. It was the best available answer to an impossible question, given a map of the world that was fundamentally, invisibly, Completely wrong. The next time you encounter a medical consensus that sounds strange, remember the pigeon, not as evidence that medicine is always wrong, but as evidence that every generation practices medicine with the best tools currently available, and that the tools currently available are never the last word. The doctors who come after us will look back at some of what we do today the way we look at the pigeon. The question is, which parts?